Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves can free our minds.
All right, so today we are talking about Heaven and Hell by Emanuel Swedenborg. Well, you know a lot more about him, so you're going to talk about a lot more than Heaven and Hell, but
Yeah.
that's the one I've read. So I'm just going to give my really brief introduction, and then you can just fill in fill in from there. So Heaven and Hell is a book about uh, Swedenborg's dream journeys to heaven and hell, where he claimed to have talked to real angels and learned about what the land what it's like after death. Um, and I like this book a lot. It's not really a page turner exactly, but it is sort of, I don't know, it just feels very, very fun. It's pretty much the only religious book that I've really liked because
Mhm.
it just seems like it's by someone who is just a great guy, just a just a person that I like a lot.
Mhm.
And to me, like this is kind of a treacherous book because you could read it and think it's all real, but even if you did, uh, it wouldn't screw up your life. You know, it has there's like real wisdom and real human nature in here. You know, so I don't think that it would hurt you so badly if you actually took it seriously. Eh,
So, just to ask a couple of questions about your response to the book, in terms of what is likable, right? Because you have angels and you have spirits and so on. Are there any kind of distinguishing characteristics that um, might go to explain a likability?
Okay, well, okay, well, so a couple of things is that he writes the book on his own authority, and there are a couple of places where he says, you know, I know that what I wrote disagrees with church doctrine, but you know, I was there, so I know. And he says that God does not need to be worshipped, which is obvious when you think about it, because we're talking about somebody who is like infinitely bigger than any individual human, and yet all of the infinitely tiny beings relative to him, you know, must worship him, or else he's put out by this, you know. So there's a part in this book where he says, you know, there is no obligation to worship God in heaven ever, and people just kind of like well, I mean, but people want to, so they do sometimes. It's just, you know, whatever, and people pursue their interests in heaven. The angels have different guilds, kind of, and you make your own groups. You know, you kind of figure out where your place is in heaven. Uh, so it just seems like, oh, and also hell is a choice. You choose where to go after you die, and some people are so they're so attuned to hell that they cannot see the road to heaven at all, and they can only find hell. But most people can see both ways, and they can choose which direction to pursue. And
So,
also I would say, well, one more thing, and also I would say that hell is not so unappealing. I actually wish he had more material on hell in this book. There's only a small section on hell. It's mostly heaven, and to like he makes out hell to have all sorts of negative things about it, but it also sounds kind of cool. Like he says, it's endless conflict and power gaming. And to me, like you know, I wouldn't want endless conflict, but you know, uh, I don't know. It does seem like he kind of makes it like a sound like an interesting place to me.
so I mean, I think that it would be fair to say. I mean, context is historical. I know of Swedenborg more in terms of the influence that his writings had on a really important group of people in the 18th century in terms of our kind of Anglo-American traditions and the thought associated with Unitarianism. I think what's really interesting is that the things that you are picking up on and the way that you're responding are very similar to the ways in which people responded to those works in their own times. And the fact that you yourself come from scientific, mathematical background, that you are, deeply fluent in all of the kind of rational arts, and yet also find resonance with this particular way of interpreting not only Christianity, but sort of general mysticism, speaks very much to the power of Swedenborg's work. The idea that God, even if we kind of stop anthropomorphizing and go with an it or a they and forces and so on, the observation that those forces don't need your worship to call them into existence or for them to be, is a very powerful insight that, informs a lot of liberating thought. And I will come back to the ways in which sort of Neoplatonic ideas of correspondences works its way through Swedenborg stuff. But the idea that we choose heaven in life and we choose hell in life, and hell in life is an awful lot to do with power games and manipulations, right? Swedenborg has an idea that we carry those kinds of choices into the afterlife, right? And so what's really interesting about the way in which he constructs the idea of heaven is that it's not fully utopian. He's not telling you how to do it. But what is reflected in a lot of his ideas about how nice heaven is, how much of a choice there is. We can talk a little bit about some of his ideas about what happens to marriage in heaven. But it is quite an appealing version of what the world would be like if there were less prejudice, less sectarianism, more freedom, and many of the things that get associated with the French Revolution, and thus the American Revolution and all the rest of it. So I think his ideas around choice were very, very potent for his readers. So unless you want to say something else, I thought I'd just give a really brief intro kind of placement of who Swedenborg was, because it may not necessarily be obvious that we're talking about an 18th century scientist who, prior to becoming a mystic and writing these books, had spent at least 20 years making significant contributions to the areas of mathematics, anatomy, physiology. His works anticipate neurons. He had some really fairly accurate ideas about how the prefrontal cortex works.
I had no idea about that. I mean, I knew that he worked as an engineer, so I was like, he did something useful with his life. He was I mean, he just sounds like just a great guy, just a fun person, like just someone that you would just admire a lot,
I think there's no question about it. I mean, he had a very established and reputable academic career. He came to London in 1710, having done the grand tour of Europe and coming from an aristocratic family which had sort of liberal tendencies. And in that context, what that means is that they were Lutherans who were willing to entertain the idea that the idea of the Trinity was a problem. And without getting into a whole long discussion about theology in the 17th and 18th centuries, generally the mark of free thinkers all throughout Europe from the Reformation onwards can be summed up in asking, do you believe in the Trinity, e.g. the God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all being in one entity, or are you anti-Trinitarian? Do you have a whole range of ideas about the humanity of Christ, the metaphorical aspect of the Spirit, and so on and so forth? So Swedenborg came from a cultured and more kind of free-thinking family background, and then ended up in London from 1710 until 1714, which is a really interesting kind of comment on the fact that his ideas and many of the radical dissenting ideas that develop in England over the course of the next 70 years, there's a great deal of similarities. So British free thinking may well have influenced his thinking, particularly in the domains of science. And then some of his thinking around how to experience Christianity in turn really influences British culture. And some of the most notable names in sort of 18th century British culture are Unitarians, and Unitarians and the Swedenborgians are kind of like first cousins. But I do think it's interesting to speculate, you know, on how much of an artificial sense we may have in the 21st century of the division between, say, science and philosophy, metaphysics, spirituality. If we think about Joseph Priestley, right, the great chemist who discovered oxygen, he was kind of the British version of Swedenborg, in as much as he's really responsible. He's one of the 2 or 3 people responsible for founding Unitarianism. So you can see that the idea of kind of humanizing Christ, humanizing Christianity, and aligning it with a more forgiving, tolerant, personal authority. You know, as you said, Swedenborg writes, well, you know, I was there. This is my experience. I mean, there's something quite postmodern about that, right? This was true for me. Is an interesting thing to kind of think about when we think about how the conversation between science or rationality and intuition or spirituality is happening today. So yeah, that's what I will say. I mean, he did spend a significant part of his life in England. He died in London, and we can maybe talk about Blake a little bit later. But he was a very influential person who kind of came out of a cultural backwater.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for all that. That was very interesting, and I had no idea about any of that stuff. But well, I guess one thing I wanted to talk about is heaven and hell as kind of like a precursor to science fiction, and of course, you were just talking about him being a scientist. So, and to me, like this book is kind of like a science fiction book in a lot of ways, because he spends a lot of time just talking about like the geometry of heaven, and he says this really weird stuff where he says like angels do not really move through space. It's like the geometry of space-time changes when they want to be like near or far away from each other. And I was just like, whoa. I thought that was so cool.
Right. And so it makes sense, right, to discover that this guy, you know, in the 20 years before writing this book, he spent, I mean, first decade of his academic career, he was a mathematician and a geometrist and a chemist and was into metallurgy. And then the next decade, he got really into anatomy and physiology and brains. And by the time he had kind of studied math, the language of the world, then he'd studied the world, then he'd started to study the human body, and then he hit the brain, and then he had a spiritual moment, right? It makes complete sense, because as you're gaining, and he was very advanced for the time, right? He was, I think one of the reasons why Immanuel Kant decided to have a whole opinion about Swedenborg was not just because heaven and hell was popular, but because his maths were so good as well. You know, he sort of had to take him on. So to me, revisiting him for this talk really made me have a moment of, well, of course, if by the time you get to the point where you start contemplating the soul and the tissue of the brain, you start asking questions about how the world is actually organized.
Well, let me just interject there and say that I really like the idea of having like a highly respected body of serious work, such that your book of crazy stories has to be taken taken seriously by people. That's quite a good trick there.
You know, one of the things that people speculated on, right, and it's kind of interesting with regards to our current debates about fake news and the role of facts and how do you prove stuff, and you know, people getting very exercised at the idea that somebody else is lying and all this kind of stuff, right? You know, one of the things that gets debated is, was he really having visions? Was he just bullshitting about having visions? Is it a this or a that? And one of the things that struck me this time in thinking about this was some work that I came across a few years ago that was speculating on two hemispheres in the brain, and was speculating that in the early stages of the cognitive revolution, human beings really did experience the voice of gods. You know, it's all throughout all the classical literature, the idea that the gods are speaking to people. And that as we evolved from chimpanzee state to, say, symbolic language state, we did go through a period of time where the internalized voice and the externalized voice hadn't really integrated properly well enough. But I just bring it up to suggest that the human experience of having an externalized voice and some form of hallucination has been with us from the very beginning. And while we have, most of us, you know, working knowledge with the phrase of schizophrenia and so on and so forth, it may be a far more natural state of crazy than a full-on crazy state of crazy.
Oh man, okay. So I totally love what you said there, and that was actually something that was in my notes. I was going to say, like, you really could think that he just, well, to me, I was going to say, like, I think it's a normal part of the human experience to just kind of wake up and just realize, hey, I could just make stuff up, and just, you can just do that, you know. And once you figure out like how to write crazy stuff, you know, in a way that's going to pick up on people's emotions in the right way, then maybe you just go and deliberately make up a fantasy heaven and hell in order to promote a nicer world. But on the other hand, like your idea is kind of well, I mean, that's kind of plausible too. Like, I think that is true, that people in the past had a less integrated way of thinking than we do today. So it could also be that he is someone who like his crazy mind, his religious mind is not constrained by the rational mind very much. So he has a rational mind that can do science really well, and then his religious mind can make up stories really well, and there's just not such a lot of communication between them. And the religious mind is just kind of like we need a nicer society here. Let's imagine a heaven that
Right.
isn't crazy.
Right. And but, you know, as you're talking, the word that keeps banging in my head is, you know, creativity, right? I mean, there is something to be said, even in, you know, right now, right here, the creative experience can be reported, you know, as some kind of externalizing force that's functioning within you, whether one's a writer or a painter. There, you know, it's just repeated over and over again. And the extent to which we will go, or we're accustomed to describing it actually as external to us, as opposed to a force within us, you know, makes me wonder about, you know, Plato's observation about the divine madness of poets, you know, whether or not it is actually possible to be creative without having certain markers of craziness or madness and so on. But I think one of the things that's important to think about in terms of Swedenborg's work is how important the idea of correspondences was. And that's a Neoplatonic, Platonic idea that as below, above. And so the idea, whether or not he was actually having visions as a kind of externalized event, or he was using a metaphorical language to describe an emotional state, his speculation about the way in which life here and life in the heavens was a reflection of fundamental way of seeing things, which was that any pattern that you found in one place was going to be repeated elsewhere in the universe. So your original point about, hey, wow, look, here's this guy who presents a version of hell where you get a choice, is a corresponding reflection of, hey, look, here you are in life and you get a choice. And that goes to part of where his sort of theological tradition and resistance was the idea that he was very much against the Lutheran idea of solo fide, or just, only faith. His idea was that you actually had to choose to do good works. He was also very much against the idea of predestination. So those kinds of insights show up in his reflection of, you get to choose hell, you get to choose heaven. When you get to heaven, you get to have all kinds of choices, especially if you get to heaven having had an unhappy marriage, choose to find somebody else to spend eternity with. Which is a kind of interesting comment on like early female rights and divorce and stuff like that. So I think this shows up also in his reading of anatomy, right? I mean, I think going all the way back to Leonardo, you see people responding to the reality that when you start looking at the patterns in nature and you start looking at the patterns in the human body, you're seeing correspondences all over the place if you're aware.
I just wanted to compare to another book, The Pilgrim's Progress, which is kind of like a really awful book, I think. There's no choice. There's no choice in that book, because the character of the pilgrim, and it's like representing the Christian life. He just kind of goes on and he just enters a new land, and it is always just about him staying distant from whatever happens to him, and he does not exercise choice in the story. And I don't know, like it horrifies me that people used to have to think like that,
Used to?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well,
I think what's really interesting about Swedenborg, right, is that he who had such an enormous and European-wide influence. I mean, the number of people, just even in Wikipedia, right, a list of influence of Swedenborg's writing, massive influence, no? And yet consistently and absolutely throughout his lifetime expressed no desire, and in fact expressed an anti-desire to form a church, to form a group, to leverage any kind of fully systematized set of rules or conclusions from his visions or his insights and all the rest of it. And yet Swedenborgianism is turned into a sect by a group of English intellectuals and middle-class sort of dissenters, non-Church of England people. And it's precisely how sectarian, how cultish the New Jerusalem Church becomes that provides motivation for William Blake leaving it. So what's kind of interesting to me as one traces the influence of his ideas throughout England in particular is to see how even the most anti-cult position can be mobilized to become the basis on which sectarian dogmatism starts to emerge.
I just think you have to if the original act of creativity is not part of the group that is formed later, then it's a then you have to control people to keep following it. That's really
and you use it as a vehicle. Right, but you also, I think this is the other part about the nature of human power, right, is that all of these, whether they're sacred texts or they're life stories or whatever they are, they become vehicles for other agenda, right? So part of the way in which you can see Swedenborg's kind of buffet of ideas and his emphasis on you yourself having your own spiritual experience and all the rest of it, it suddenly becomes a vehicle for certain decisions around class. This is the experience in sort of the 1780s into the 1790s as the French Revolution picks up steam, and there is a real backlash in England against people who are in any way supportive of the kind of liberal causes. Swedenborganism gets used as a vehicle for precisely expressing those social political moves. And that's how, for example, Blake decides to leave, because he is once and forever a sort of radical egalitarian Democrat. So it's kind of interesting to me to revisit a bunch of stuff that I got really deep about once upon a time.
Yeah, well, thankfully nothing like that happens today.
No, of course not. We don't have 9/11 and 20 years of fallout. No, of course not.
I was actually thinking about Bitcoin.
Precisely, right? But I will say that I think some of the kind of sectarianism and the emotional focus on lying, instead of the challenge of open mind and multiple points of view that Bitcoin sits within, have been gathering force for some time. And the longer that I examine this, the more I start to see certain elements of the ways of interacting that there are between the various sects as reflective of how all kinds of sects are are in full-on interaction with each other. And sometimes I think it really comes down to having all kinds of opinions about people that you don't actually know.
Yeah.
And that you're vulnerable to being presented with the most black and white two-dimensional version of who those others are, simply because you have no empirical knowledge of your own against which to test it. That's just one observation.
So I just have a few more notes left. So back to the science fiction thing. There's one other book that I read by Swedenborg, and it's called Earths in the Universe, like Earth, like the planet Earth, then Earths plural, so Earths in the Universe. And I just know that sound might not come through very well, but that's the idea, is that he has met angels in heaven. He only went to heaven,
of course.
But in heaven, he met angels who lived on other planets when they were alive. So he writes about what it's like on other planets. So this book is almost like Star Trek, because each planet has a different personality, and he has the other known planets in the solar system, and then he also has just some other planets. He has a few other planets, and he's just like, I don't know where these ones are. And each
astral planes, right?
Yeah, and each planet has a different personality. The people on the planet have like a different way of relating to God, and he mainly talks about religion. Like he talks about the religion of the different people on each planet, but it's kind of like how, like on Star Trek, where there's like the rationality planet, and the Vulcans, and then there's like the warrior race planet in the Klingons. It's kind of like that.
It's funny because I don't know very much about this text at all, and so this is the part where I get to learn, and I've learned more through doing this episode with you. And one of the things that struck me was, I think this is not far off the period where Captain Cook is discovering Australia. And while, America had been discovered a couple hundred years beforehand, we're still in a stage of pretty substantial discovery.
Oh, wow. I love that. That is awesome, because that is like such a perfect like science fiction thing to do. You're just like I'll represent these different. I'll say that like the different peoples around the world. It's like going to different planets. Oh my God, that is so much like Star Trek. That is that is just Star Trek right there.
Right, so much like Star Trek, but also I would argue that reading backwards, right? Swedenborg had had a high Renaissance classical education, so his knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans would have been substantial. And so, in some ways, what he's doing is also harkening back to an ancient kind of insight that we can discuss all the different types of humanity, right? I mean, Star Trek generally only deals with bipeds. No, I mean, I don't really remember that many things that they interact with that have 8 legs or shape like
that show is completely insane.
I mean, you know, the Borg is different, but even they are walking around on 2 legs. So, you know, there is this way of exploring all the different features of humanity through, you know, the gods, their planetary associations, Captain Cook, New Worlds, or even just on the microcosm within your own city. And so again, I think what you see here in operation is not some kind of philosophical treatise on Neoplatonism. It's really just a way of pointing out that this very powerful idea that we can see repetitive patterns and links between things was a very main framework in which he was doing all of his thinking.
So the last note I had is I wanted to talk about the Nietzschean Superman. Because to me, this book is kind of a good way of thinking about that. And to me, the thing that makes Swedenborg not a Nietzschean Superman is you choose heaven or hell once, and then you just stay in there. And so if he had written that you can go out and go to heaven for a while and then go back and forth, then that's like the Nietzschean Superman. And so to me, like this book kind of suggests that each person chooses one path or the other. But the Nietzschean Superman kind of has like, or another way of looking at it is saying like, how much am I in heaven and how much am I in hell? And the fact that Swedenborg spends about, you know, a fourth or a fifth of the book on hell suggests that he is mostly in heaven. But the Nietzschean Superman would also make choices about it depending on what's going on outside. So the Nietzschean Superman would say, now is a good time to be in hell, and now is a good time to get out of hell and go back to heaven. You know.
You know, that's really awesome. No, that's really awesome and interesting, right? No, I think that both would absolutely agree on the idea that there is an ongoing choice process. I mean, I think that Swedenborg's observation that you even get to choose by the time you get to the afterlife is a reflection on the fact that you've been able to choose all along the way. And I think that goes to some of those theological framework points about you don't just presume that you have faith and you have faith once. It's just not the way you go about doing it. And I think that that's finds resonance in Nietzsche's idea that if you submit to a kind of Lutheran, Calvinist, Catholic version, you're effectively saying, I think once, and I do not have to continue to struggle. I do not have to continue to think. I do not have to continue to choose. Now, I think the difference between Swedenborg and his 1/4 of the book being about hell and Nietzsche and his 3/4 of the book being about hell, right, are a little bit, I don't mean to be trite, but a little bit, it's a reflection of their individual lives. I mean, Swedenborg was also a bachelor, and Nietzsche was a bachelor. And it's an interesting observation that Swedenborg seems to have been a happier human being. And maybe that's because his internalized God experience was sending him more angels than devils. But I do think that there is a link between Swedenborg's ideas and Nietzsche, because Kant had such a strong reaction to him. And there's no way that Nietzsche was not on some level reacting to Kant. So I know that Kant is the philosopher whose name can't be discussed, as I think we made very clear. But just to say, I think your point is really provocative to line those.
I just meant that I didn't want to do an episode on Kant. We can mention him, but I just think that he's kind of like, I just think that he's like well-trodden ground, that I don't think that I have anything.
I just don't have polite things to say, and I think we covered this already. I think
Yeah.
the episode would be super short, but you know, maybe we can do them as like a postscript at some point.
Okay.
Or, but yeah, so that's a really provocative idea, and I do think that some of the radical freedom in there is traceable to the kind of thinking that informs, you know, Unitarianism in general, whether it's of the more mystical kind or it's the more rational kind. It is definitely the place in the Christian intellectual tradition, which, you know, Swedenborg, again, is a perfect example of the fact that there is a very artificial division between science, rationality, and energy insight, you know, that the brain is capable of moving across those spaces and saying really true things about both of them.
Okay, well, great discussion. I don't have anything else. Do you have anything?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I want our viewers to know that I know all this stuff because of some doctoral research I had to do in a galaxy far away 1,000 years ago, and I was absolutely delighted and a little bit thrown when Daniel asked me if I had read Swedenborg, and it was so deeply buried in the vault that for a moment I was kind of like, yeah, I think so. And then remembered that I kind of knew all this stuff. But thank you for, returning to a place that, you know, that was very familiar to me, but with now some fresh vision. Because of our work.
No, let me thank you. I mean, I thought I had well, I think that you are the only other person that I know who has read Swedenborg, and well, he gets my recommendation. So if you're watching, yeah, he's I enjoyed reading him, and
Me too.
I'm just glad I met you through the internet, and we were able to have discussions like this.
Me too. So next time we'll do another great and treacherous thinker. And thank you all for watching. And see you next time.